Okay, can you see my slide again? Jane?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
beautiful. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for jumping on the call. Today, we're going to be talking about investigation contingencies and the importance in understanding how to navigate these contingencies, right? Especially investigation and the importance of when and when not to release these conditions. So a lot of the information that I provide you is straight from the California Association of Realtors through the legal tools. This is where I pull up most of the information to provide you with the necessary resource, educational platform, and more so guidance in your position. So under the inspection contingency, paragraph 3L3 of the RPA automatically gives a buyer a 17-day period of time to investigate all aspects of the property. So under the purchase agreement, Jane, there's, the new purchase agreement, it gives you, what we call the grid, right? The grid of all these time to remove contingencies. Now, the awesome part of why I like this new purchase agreement, it all is very uniform. If you look at the time to remove contingency, loan, 17 days, appraisal, 17 days, investigation of property, 17 days, informational access to the property, 17 days, review of seller documents, 17 days, preliminary title report, 17 days, common interest disclosures, 17 days, and review of lease or lien items, 17 days. Now, if you look at the far right where it says contingency removal, under paragraph 3, Al is in Lincoln, it provides you with not just the time frame to release this as a condition, but it also provides you with the opportunity for your clients to release that as part of the contingency period. Automatically, no, but in writing, yes. All right, so the process is very, very simple. The process is the buyer has 17 days or, right, and there's a blank, or it can be more than 17 days or less than 17 days after acceptance. Well, when is acceptance? Okay, when the buyer and the seller mutually agree to the terms, then you have an accepted agreement. That starts your 17-day period. Now, the day of acceptance is considered 0 days, right? From there, that day is 0. The following day is the 1 day of 17 days to release this as a condition. Now, the buyer also has the opportunity to release that as a condition, right? Where it says no loan contingency, no appraisal contingency. Removing appraisal contingency does not eliminate the appraisal cancellation right under the FVAC, meaning that if your clients are compelled to release the appraisal contingency as part of the agreement and the property does not appraise at the offer price, that does not give the buyer the opportunity, right? The opportunity to cancel based on that appraisal evaluation. And you can argue the fact saying, well, because of the appraisal, I cannot get the loan because I have insufficient funds. Well, that's still not a good reason. This is why you want to hold on to that appraisal contingency as long as you can, which is 17 days, right? You can modify it, increase it, or decrease it, but 17 days is the contingency of that removal, and also loan contingency and the rest of these contingencies in place. Now, if you look just below where it says removal or waiver of contingencies, any contingencies in L1 through L7 may be removed or waived by checking the applicable box above or attaching a contingency removal CAR form CR and checking the box therein, removing or waiving all time of offer is against the advice of the agent or the broker in itself. So there, if you check off CR attach, right? If you were to check off this section, then what it's going to do, it's going to populate the contingency removal. Now, all contracts have to be in writing. All contracts need to have some type of documentation in order for this to be released. Just because you check it off as removing it does not ultimately hold the buyer responsible for any breach of the contract. The buyer still would have to provide the seller a copy of the contingency removal form, and the listing agent should enforce the buyer's agent to provide that as part of the process, okay? Meaning that if the buyer is going to release any and all or some of these contingencies, you as the listing agent want to be proactive in your engagement, and you want to make sure that the buyer and the buyer's agent are diligent in their performance by requesting a copy of that. So if you get an offer, right, you get an offer received, you're going to go through the terms and conditions. Now, the counter offer, if they did not provide you with the contingency removal, part of the stipulation on your seller counter offer is going to say, item wants buyer to provide a contingency removal of appraisal removal, something to that nature. Or you can emphasize, 3L2, paragraph AB appraisal to be removed under the contingency removal form CR. Something to, again, that nature, you're going to provide that if the buyer does not provide you with the CR form. You always want to back it up by having that contingency removal in place, okay? Now let's talk about waiving, right? Waiving the right requires that a contingency removal form CR to be attached to the offer. And here's where agents get a little sneaky, right? And I want to make sure that you're proactive, that if you're on the other side, the listing agent, getting an offer and they're releasing that as part of the condition, you want to make sure that you check all of the forms that there's a contingency removal, okay? And if there's not, then you're going to send a counteroffer, as illustrated here, seller counteroffer, and you're going to put here that information. Waiving the right requires that a contingency removal from form CR be attached to the offer, or a counteroffer changing the 17-day time period requires inserting a different number in the blank field or reference in the same counteroffer. Now, let's just say for the sake of argument, right, that the buyer investigation of property is only 10 days, right? Okay, that's not a release of that contingency. That's just a modification. So the modification, the seller is going to either accept or counter. Remember, all contingency removals are 17 days, right? But if there is a modification from the buyer, increasing or decreasing, you can always utilize the seller counteroffer for the purpose and the sake of understanding each and everyone's role, the buyer's role and the seller's role, right? So let's just say that the buyer's agent throws in a little wrench in this offer and says, look, I need 25 days to release loan contingency, right? You see it and you identify it by either highlighting, okay, this is something that I need to counter. Then you're going to use the seller counteroffer and you're going to say that the loan contingency section L1 8A shall be 17 days or shall be 10 days as an example, right, of loan contingencies, especially if they increase the time, because it's already set and default at 17 days. So again, you can be as creative and as great as a negotiator, making sure that you do understand your position and also, you're examining these forms, because I've seen agents, unfortunately, miss certain things. They get into a contract, they're in the assumption that 17 days is to release that condition, and the buyer hasn't released that contingency, and now the listing agent is saying, hey, we're going to send you a notice to perform, right? Well, the buyer's agent is going to say, wait, Simon, we put 25 days to release that as a condition, so that is the avenue that we're going to hold, and the seller did sign and agree to it. Okay, so you want to make sure that you are literally dissecting this offer and presenting that to the seller and letting the seller make the ultimate decision of what they want to do, right? So in reference, you're going to either have them provide you with a contingency removal, and you're going to also include, if necessary, a seller counteroffer, cleaning up the offer or the instructions from the seller. Okay. Any questions regarding contingency removals and or modifying these terms? Okay, because two things can be done here. You can modify, or you can release as part of the contingency, or even waive. All right. Either or, you want to make sure that you're providing the necessary documentation to reinforce your position, and more so when the buyer does in the future cancel, then we need to know who's in breach. Was it the seller in breach, or was it the buyer in breach? And now if the buyer is in breach and the buyer has released all contingencies, now the seller has some right for damages. And, being that the buyer did breach the contract, the seller may be entitled to some, if not all, of the deposit. Okay. All right, the contingency gives a buyer a contractual excuse to cancel, right? Every contingency is like a wall, in my opinion, right? There's layers of wall that eventually, once you release those walls, the buyer's deposit can be exposed and can be transferred ultimately to the seller if the buyer is in breach of the contract. So during the period, if the buyer is not satisfied with the condition of the property or any other matters affecting the desirability of the property, the buyer has every right to cancel. So, for example, let's say I represent the buyer, right? I'm going in there. Buyer says, hey, I love this place. Let's go ahead and submit an offer. We submit an offer, and the default is 17 days, right? The default is 17 days. Well, that's 17 days that the buyer has. If the seller has agreed to these terms on the purchase agreement, then the seller cannot unilaterally just cancel. It has to be the buyer's. It's like playing offense and defense, right? The buyer is the offense and the seller can be in the defense. But once the buyer releases any and all contingencies, now it really converts the seller for opportunity. If the buyer does not perform, now the seller can seek damages and go after your buyer's deposit. But during that inspection period or any time period to release that as a condition, that's basically a opportunity for the buyer to do any inspections, any thorough third-party quotes to determine what it's going to cost to repair, replace any type of repairs, right? So the buyer within that time frame has the ability to cancel. And the buyer can cancel just because it smells funny. It doesn't look as well. The rooms are too small. Or just the condition of the property is going to cost them more than they anticipate. The buyer has that right to send out a cancellation of contract, back out of the deal, and retain, if not all of their deposit. Okay, but it's when the buyer releases any and all contingencies, meaning they're 100% released everything. That's when the buyer's deposit is in jeopardy, and it's basically exposing the buyer's deposit. So I want you to understand paragraph 8 under contingencies and removal of contingencies. There's a section on paragraphs 8C, subsection 3, that says investigation. This agreement is specified in paragraph 3L3, contingent upon buyer acceptance of the condition of any other matters affecting the property. See paragraph 12. And then paragraph 12 goes into, buyer's responsibility. Then it goes into paragraph 14, all right? Most people back out under paragraph 14B, okay? That's when they usually decide we're exercising our paragraph 14B of the contract. And what 14B allows the buyer an opportunity is buyer to review documents, request of repairs, contingency removal, or cancellation. So what it says there is, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, we're going to review all of the disclosures you're providing. Mr. and Mrs. Sellers, we're going to ask for a request of repairs or a credit or a price reduction. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, we're either going to remove some or all contingencies, or Mr. and Mrs. Seller, we're going to cancel under paragraph 14B, okay? And if the buyer has one contingency left, right, it depends on the scenario, because if you release physical inspections, right, meaning you're waiving or you have released that, then ultimately the buyer cannot back out of that as part of the cancellation if new issues arise, right? Now, with that being said, I want to be very crystal clear. If a new material fact is provided by the seller or something happens and now that is disclosed to the buyer has 5 additional days to investigate, review, and make a decision if they're going to continue moving forward or decide to cancel. Even after releasing that as part of that contingency, the buyer may still back out and the buyer may still be able to retain their deposit. So I want to be very clear that if you are representing a buyer, buyer's doing their due diligence, buyer releases that as an inspection, buyer now gets a new material fact that may jeopardize the desirability of the home. Buyer has 5 additional days to review, do investigations, go to the property, determine what it's going to cost. Buyer can still put a request of repairs, or the buyer may have the right to cancel. Okay. That's only if there's additional material facts that can affect the desirability of the home. Okay. Under 14B, subsection 3, it says other requests made and may only cancel based on contingencies in this agreement. Buyer shall, by the end of the time specified in paragraph 3L or otherwise in agreed, deliver to seller a removal of the contingency or cancel of this agreement. What it says here is very simple, okay? That in order for the buyer to decide to cancel, right, the buyer needs to, provide either the release, and this is the buyer giving this to the seller, release of the contingency. Let's just say that the 17 days is to release all contingencies, right? Loan, appraisal, disclosures, HOAs, entrance to the property, whatever the case may be. Buyer at that point in time says, well, you know what? I don't know. I need a little bit more time to release this as a condition. Well, based on paragraph 14B3, it says 2 things: deliver to seller a removal of the contingency or cancel this agreement. What it doesn't say is that the buyer also has the right to ask for an extension to release that as a condition. meaning that if you are getting close to that time frame to release that as part of your contingency period, and you know you're not going to meet that timeline, you as a real estate professional need to ask for an extension of time. The form is called ETA. That extension of time allows you or grants you, again, granting you the extension. The seller does not have to provide you with the extension. And I want to be clear on this. If the 17 days is upon us or shall be within a few days, and you know you cannot release that, you meaning the buyer cannot release that, you're going to ask for an extension of time to release that as part of contingency. If you need another additional couple of days, maybe another week, whatever the case may be, you as a professional need to be in dialogue and constant communications with the buyer, and more so constant communications with the lender as well. Because the lender is going to give you thumbs up or thumbs down if they're ready to go, if they've been approved for the loan, or if there's some serious serious conditions that need to be addressed, and that may take a little bit of extra time, and the lender may feel compelled that the buyer is not ready to release that as a loan contingency. Now, here's where the listing agent has to be very proactive, okay? Because I hear this quite often, and it's, again, agents that fall short on their positions, meaning they're not really engaged in having those conversations with asking the right questions to the buyer's agent. And that's something that you need to be in the beginning stage and asking, well, who's the lender? What is the conditions that we need to know of? Do they need to sell something in order for them to qualify for a new loan? Verifying, if they're putting 20%, do they have proof of funds to back them up? Because I've seen firsthand where a buyer submits an offer, buyer has proof of funds, and that proof of funds says 20%. And then you look at their financials, right? And their financials show that it's less than 20%. Now you need to kind of scratch your head and say, where is the additional, $80,000 coming from? I have financials with one account, but it doesn't match to what they're putting down. Remember, those are questions you need to be asking if it doesn't, fill in that puzzle, right? And that can be a discrepancy, or maybe that's something that the buyer's agent failed to provide. Oh, Simon, thank you very much. I totally forgot they have an additional bank account. Here is the additional bank account with the extra $150,000 to prove that we have the means to put a 20% down. Because 20% down is a significant amount, and that may alter or jeopardize the loan. If they don't have it, you need to make sure that you are getting all the necessary documents to evaluate and determine if this is the candidate that's going to get their offer accepted. Because I've seen agents accept because they're putting 25%, but they fail to ask for proof of funds. And then they're in escrow, the deal doesn't go through, and you're questioning, well, what happened? Well, they didn't have enough money to put down. Well, if they would have disclosed and been honest with you from the very beginning, you wouldn't have had this hiccup alter. Now you're 2-3 weeks in, and now you got to start back again and find another qualified buyer and go through the motions of negotiations. So what I'm saying here, folks, is be diligent, be active, and ask a lot of questions. That'll save you from the heartache that these deals may potentially cancel. Your job is to secure that transaction and to finish and close the deal and get paid a commission. All right, so the contingency stays in place until removal in writing by the buyer. The buyer is entitled to return of any deposit made if the buyer does decide to cancel. Once removed, the contingency cannot be exercised if the buyer later learns something new about the property. Now, with that being said, as I said earlier, It really is a very sensitive approach when you release that as part of the contingency. Meaning that once the buyer releases physical inspections, right, you cannot come back and say, well, I know I released physical inspections, but now I want to get additional inspections done, or I'm going to ask for another list of stuff that I'm asking for requests and repairs. So be diligent in your approach and be, again, proactive and making sure that everything that your buyer is going to ask is done in the very beginning, so that way there's no misunderstanding and obviously arguments between the agents. So under 14B4, it talks about the continuance of contingencies, even after the end of the time specified in paragraph 3L, right? That's 17 days to release loan contingencies, right? 17 days to release appraisal contingency, right? Whatever that contingency is, right? We already showed you that it's 17 days to release most of, if not all of the contingencies. I want to be very clear in our approach that it's your job, right? Your job to navigate this and make sure that you are in the timelines to release this. It's not the seller's responsibility or the listing agent's responsibility. It's the buyer's responsibility to release this. And I know a lot of buyers agents will stay under the radar as much as they possibly can, so that way they do not release that immediately. Because as I said earlier, the contingencies are like walls. Every wall that you release exposes the seller more and more to go after the buyer's deposit. Now, section 14B, effecting of removal of contingencies. It says, agreed, buyer shall conclusively be deemed to have, 1, completed all buyer investigations and review of reports and other inapplicable information and disclosures pertaining to that contingency or cancellation right. Number 2, elect to proceed with the transaction, meaning you elect to continue going forward with the close of this deal. And 3, assume all liabilities, responsibilities, and expenses for non-delivery of any reports, disclosures, information outside of seller's control, and any repairs or corrections pertaining to the contingency or cancellation right, or for the inability to obtain the financing. Okay. Again, I want to be very clear on this because this is a very powerful statement here. Removing a buyer's contingency is an exposure to the buyer's deposit. The whole purpose of why we do what we do is if the seller is in the game to sell, right? They want to use any and all platforms to get the highest possible price with the least amount of headaches to net them the most, right? That's the end goal for any seller, is get the highest with the least amount of headaches, so that way the seller gets the most, if not a large part of the proceeds, right? Now, but part of all that is the responsibility of the seller to be in a position that all that can be washed away if the buyer does not release contingencies. Okay. And releasing contingencies exposes the buyer's money. So the listing agent is going to do any and everything to push to get this deal closed, right? Because that's the end goal for any buyers or sellers, is to close the deal, Now, if there's no cooperation from the buyer or there's no cooperation from the seller, what can you do? Well, you send out the notice to perform. If it's the buyer not performing, then you send the buyer's notice to perform. If the seller is not performing, then you send the seller's non-performing, right? But the section here gives you the understanding that one, you assume all responsibilities and liability, and that non-delivery of any reports or disclosures, information outside of the seller's control, or any repairs, corrections pertaining to the contingency, cancellation, or any ability to obtain finances. So basically what it's saying is, if you release that as a condition and you cannot get the approval of the loan, then the seller still has the right to go after your deposit, because one, you dragged your feet, you're not proactive, you spend 30 to 45 days in escrow, and now you tell us that you cannot qualify. This is why listing agents, you need to be very diligent that when the time is to release a contingency, then that's the time that the buyer needs to release it, or send the notice to perform, or that the buyer ultimately cancels, you put the property back on the market and move on to another buyer. So again, all these paragraphs have a meaning. All these paragraphs have your answer to most, if not all, your questions on the do's and don'ts. If buyer fails to remove that as a contingency within the stated time frame, what's the stated time frame? 17 days. The seller has any opportunity to cancel after first giving the buyer the notice to perform, which is the NBP form. When that happens, then the buyer is entitled to return of any deposit made. So section C, seller's right to cancel, right? If the buyer breaches the contract, the seller has to stay on track and provide the necessary documentation. And that documentation is very simple, okay? That documentation is the notice to perform, okay? You can give a break, or you can be as concise in your position and be very rigid, meaning that you don't have to wait till the 17th day to get that as a release of that contingency. But what you can do is send a notice to perform 2 days prior of that 17 days. So by the 15th day, the listing agent can send, or the buyer's agent can send that as a release of that particular contingency. Okay. Does that mean that if I send it on the 15th, that the seller, or excuse me, that the buyer has to release it on the 15th? The answer is no. The only time you release it is on the date agreed upon, which was on the 17th day. The reason listing agents send out a contingency or removal 2 days prior is to alleviate any additional time to release that as a condition. So, for example, if an agent waits till the 17th day to release that as a condition and the buyer doesn't, then the seller and the listing agent are going to send you a notice to perform. That notice to perform allows an additional 48 hours. So meaning that if the property falls on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, okay, or Thursday, then ultimately the buyer, if after giving a notice to perform, allows an additional 48 hours to release that as a condition. Now, with that being said, if the contingency falls on a weekend or holiday, then ultimately that contingency gets released on the next business days. For example, Labor Day was upon us, right? A lot of people were celebrating Labor Day over this weekend, right? We had Monday, Sunday, and Saturday, right? For a lot of us. So if a contingency, let's say an appraisal, physical inspection, falls on any of those 3 days, then it ultimately reverts to the next business day. So typically Saturday and Sunday, right? And then Monday is the next business days. But because Monday was a holiday, a national holiday, then that gets pushed till Tuesday, which is today. I hope that kind of makes sense. So the seller's right to cancel is very, very important component to this, because the seller has the right to cancel buyer contingency if the time specified, right, in agreement does not deliver. Now, it says that the buyer deliver the contingency removal, right? Now, the delivery to the seller to remove that as part of the contingency, right? Or the cancellation. So either two things will happen, right? One, the buyer proactively releases that, sends the listing agent contingency removal, or the seller sends out the notice to perform and says, hey, you know what? We're sending you the notice to perform, or the listing agent can send you, the buyer's agent, a contingency removal too, requesting that the buyer release that as part of the contingency. Okay. Hope that kind of helps and makes sense. And if you have any questions, please let me know. I know it's a lot of material, but this is again why it's very crucial and very, very important that you understand inspection contingencies, the do's and don'ts. Because once you release that, it's going to be hard to articulate your position if you need to back out because the condition of the property. But wait a minute, you released that as part of the condition. Therefore, that is not a good avenue, Mr. or Mrs. Buyer, for canceling. Therefore, we're going to have to go to mediation, or you got to give me some compensation for breaching the contract. Now, you know, there's two sides to this, right? There's the seller side, there's the buyer side. Okay. Either can be right or either can be wrong. This is why real estate professionals step in to navigate and make it a win for all parties. And ultimately, your client's best interest, right? If you represent the buyer or the seller. The moral of what I'm trying to explain is, you know, you want to protect your clients, because once that buyer deposit is exposed, there's no guarantee that the seller will not try to challenge and fight for that deposit. And that deposit can be up to 3% of the purchase price. So obviously, the higher the purchase price, the more money is involved and the more of a risk the buyer has. Now, I get this quite often. Well, Simon, can I put less than what the 3% of the deposit? If I'm submitting an $800,000 price point, but my buyer is only compelled to only put $10,000 deposit instead of, you know, $30,000 deposit, right? Remember, it's up to 3%. And I'm just doing this for illustration purposes, folks. Can the buyer submit an offer with less than 3% deposit? The answer is yes. Yeah. They can send whatever they want, but it's up to the seller and the listing agent to determine, yeah, I'm willing to accept these terms, or nope, I'm going to counter you. I'm going to have you raise the deposit from 10,000 to 30,000, because now you have more skin in the game. Now that deposit also includes part of your down payment, all right? So when you're calculating your figures, make sure that the top number matches the bottom number and all the arithmetic in between to make sure that there's no discrepancy on your offer. You want to double check, triple check, and quadruple check sometimes, and make sure that you have all the elements and all the key filled in. You don't want to be that agent that failed to put something, failed to strike or remove, and now you're obligated because it was agreed upon, even though that was not the direction you wanted to go. So I want to stress and emphasize that the importance of it. All right, so the investigation contingency, let's see, okay. Yeah. The investigation contingency include inspections of the physical attributes of the property, any other matters affecting the property. Under subsection 12B, A, B, C, D, and section 2, it says about the buyer's investigation of property and matters affecting the property. So inspections regarding any physical attributes of the property or items connected to the property, such as a general home inspection, any inspections for lead-based paint and any other lead-based paint hazards, any inspections specifically for wood destroying pests, any inspections for wood destroying pests and organization shall be prepared by a registered structure pest control company, shall cover the main building and any attached structure may be covered, or detached structures shall not include water testing of shower pads or any upper level unit unless the owner of the property below that shows showers consents shall not include roof covering and so on. And so it goes into the verbiage, right? So the investigation of any encompass means that you can do a home inspection, you can do a plumbing inspection, you can do a roof inspection, you can do electrical inspection, you can do sewer inspections, you can do landscape contract, adding square footage as part of that contingency, right? All these investigations that lead to you releasing that as part of the contingency is the responsibility of both parties, meaning the buyer releasing that contingency and the seller reinforcing that the buyer is moving forward with it. If the buyer is not 100% in agreements to the overall condition, the buyer again going back can send out a request of repairs or ask to decide to back out of the deal and cancel. Walk away, clean their hands. The only thing they probably lost is, the home inspection, maybe an appraisal was done. But in essence, one, you're not obligated to buy the property. Two, you're going to get most, if not every part of your deposit back. So it's how you navigate these conversations, folks, that will lead, again, the win for your clients, or the blames that come with it, right? Well, you didn't release it. Now the listing agent has a bad taste in their mouth because they just do not trust your committed approach in getting the deal closed. So you gotta look at all elements of this. Any questions so far? Okay. 14, time period, removal of contingency, cancellation right. If the buyer has a good faith dissatisfaction with the property or any condition affecting it, the buyer may cancel the transaction during investigation contingency period. Remember, the buyer has the time frame, that window of opportunity to do as many inspections as they desire. If that's hiring multiple home inspections, multiple roof inspections, okay, the buyer within their time frame has the ability to do so, because the buyer needs to satisfy themselves to the overall condition of the property. And if they're not completely happy, they have the right to cancel, walk away, move on, find another property, or they can ask for a request of repairs. Either Mr. and Mrs. Seller fix, Mr. and Mrs. Seller give me the credit, or Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I'm going to ask for a price reduction. And all of those threes are part of your responsibility to navigate those conversations with the buyer, because whose money are you jeopardizing, right? Not you in general, but who are you jeopardizing their deposit? The buyers, right? The buyers have some skin in the game. And a seller would not even accept someone that is not willing to commit and accept. Maybe you have these far and few that, very little deposit, or maybe inter family transfers, then you're not going to see any type of deposit. It's going to be a very streamlined process. Buyer, if buyer has good faith dissatisfaction with the property or any condition affected, the buyer may cancel the transaction, investigation contingency, contingency removal, and cancellation of contract. Now let's dive deep into the request of repairs. If the buyer is requesting some type of incentive, right? Property may be a fixer-upper, property may need just here, little there, but the buyer has the right. Now, this is something that I find very interesting, that listing agents already reinforce that the property is going to be sold in its as-is condition. Well, if you know the contracts very well, you know that all contracts already have that provision on the purchase agreement that says that all properties are sold in its as-is condition. Meaning that the seller does not have to approve your request. The seller does not have to give you credit. The seller does not have to provide you with an extension of time. So I want to make sure that we're all on the same page, that if the buyer's requesting a repair, credit, or even a price reduction, the seller can come back and say, look, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, you are in contract. We're not going to give you an extension. You must release this as a contingency. Otherwise, we're going to have to cancel. Okay. I hope that kind of makes sense. More so, and these are requests, because this is where we see most of the deals fall apart, is during this negotiation period. Some agents have challenging in finding opportunities where other agents don't. They get fed opportunities left and right. But the request of repairs, that's where we see a lot of cancellation, because there's no meeting of the mind, meaning that the buyer, the seller do not have an agreement, because both have to agree, right? Both have to agree to their positions. And if they don't agree, then either or mutual cancellation must happen. So the buyer may use the request of repairs form RR to request that the seller repair defect before close of escrow, or lower the purchase price or give some type of buyer credit to the purchase price. Buyers agreed to remove the investigation contingency in order to continue with the transaction if seller agrees to buyer's request. Okay. Now here's an illustration of request of repairs, right? This is the buyer asking the seller for some request of repairs. Now, I said earlier that all properties are sold in its as-is condition, right? And it is. It's on the contract. All properties are sold in its as-is condition. And it's something that I've seen where listing agents will reinforce it on their counter offer, and they'll say something to this nature: properties being sold in its as-is condition, buyer not to request any repair or give any type of credit, and you sign it, right? Well, now the interpretation is, the interpretation that I see is that the buyer cannot ask for any type of request, because three things on this request of repair, I should say, stipulates, right? Fix it, Mr. and Mrs. Seller. In lieu of fixing it, give us credit, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, or do a price reduction, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, right? So be smart in your approach on this, because if all property are sold in its as-is condition and the counter from the seller says, do not ask for any type of credit or any repairs, okay, then go after the price reduction. They didn't say that on the counter offer. You only said repairs or credit. And what if that credit is $10,000 that you want done? Now you can kind of wiggle your way through the side and says, well, I'm still going to send that request, and we're going to ask for a $10,000 price reduction from 800 to now a 790. Okay. Well, Simon, I told you that we were not going to do any type of credit. Yeah, you said no repairs and no credit. But after, my buyer reviewing all the issues with the property, my buyer is compelled that they want a price reduction. Now, Mr. or Mrs. Listing agent, I'm hoping that we're on the same page, that if we decide to cancel, you got to put the property back on the market, find a new buyer, go through the negotiations aspect of it. Any new disclosures that we provide you on the request of repairs, or even providing you with a report, now that's considered material fact that you have to pass on to the new a new buyer. And there's still no guarantee that that new buyer may even close, because they're going to be in the same boat. Why don't we stick it out, work as a team, get this deal closed so we can all move on? Seller gets to sell the property, buyer gets to buy the property. I need your help in helping me close that gap, make it a win. All right, well, let me talk to the seller and see what I can do. Okay, comes back and the listing agent says, look, we cannot do 10,000, but we're willing to do 5,000. All right, I'm going to give that information to the buyer, Mr. Mrs. Buyer. After speaking with the listing agent, they came back on a price. Instead of $790, they came back at $795, which is a $5,000 price reduction from the original offer we made at $800,000. Are you okay with that? No. I still think 10,000 is the sweet spot. All right. Well, you're the agent and you're responsible to making sure that you're taking care of your clients, right? Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, are you certain that you're going to stick with your guns on this? Because again, this can backfire as well, right? So all properties are sold in as-is condition. They didn't specify that not to ask for a price reduction. I'm just using that angle in order for you to, get something. Yeah, I'm fine with that. Go with 790 as well. Okay. So now you're going to prepare requests of repair number 2, right? And that request of repair number 2 is going to say the same thing as request number 1, right? Price shall be 790. And then you're going to send it over again. And the listing agent is going to call you and say, well, Simon, I thought we already agreed the seller's is not going to come down on the price. We are firm on that 795. Well, I understand, Mr. and Mrs. Agent. We're so close, but yet we're so far. Okay. Your client is at 795. My client is at 790. Are we going to kill this deal over $5,000? Think about this for a minute. The deal is going to fall apart over 5,000. Okay. Let's meet in the middle and see if I can raise my client to meet us halfway. Your seller come down halfway, right? So now the offer would be 792.5 instead of 790. Your buyer goes up half and the seller comes down half, and we meet right in the middle, right? Now that may work. If it works, congratulations, you're still in the game. If it doesn't work, then unfortunately either the buyer needs to come in at the price, or the buyer has the right to cancel, retain their deposit, and move on to another property. So this is why these forms are crucial in the negotiation aspect of it. I always emphasize, there's negotiations in the beginning, there's negotiations in the middle, and there's always going to be some type of negotiations even towards the end. Okay. And then this leads to the negotiating aspect, right? Which is the RR, the RRRR, and then the AEA form, right? The contingency period set the outside time to reach an agreement. You can utilize any of these 4 items, right? Buyer submits the request, seller's response to the buyer's request, and then the amendment of the existing agreement. Now, this form is not new, but it is new, meaning that it hasn't been in existence but maybe 2 years. And the amendment of existing agreement terms allows you to have a time of expiration, where if you look at the request of repair, there's no expiration date. The seller's response of a buyer's reply, right, doesn't have an expiration. But the amendment of existing agreement has that the buyer or the seller has 2 days or 3 days to come with an answer. And if not, then that deal gets canceled. Now, that form also is a shield, that the lender will not get, because part of the agreement stipulates that the buyer is entitled to any additional documentation. If the buyer is requesting a $10,000, $15,000, $20,000, right, the underwriter may get that and now use that as part of the their condition. And that can alter the buyer from getting the loan, and that can alter the buyer from getting the financing, right? The financing and the loan aspect of it. So if you know it's a very sensitive wire that you're kind of trying to navigate, then you can always include the amendment of existing agreement terms. Okay. So here's some best practice, right? Buyers should interview home inspectors prior to writing any offer, so that once an offer is accepted, buyer does not waste valuable contingency removal time finding the inspections, right? This is where you want to be diligent, folks, and making sure that the buyer has at least 2 to 3 inspections lined up, meaning I have inspection 1, inspection 2, inspection 3. You know, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, pick whatever inspections that you feel comfortable with, because the moment we open escrow, we immediately want to set an appointment to get an inspection done of the property. That is part of the due diligence aspect of it. Okay, number 2, buyers should review the complete inspection report with the inspector. Part of the cool thing of the inspection reports is once you get that report, and if there's any concerns, questions, you know, the buyer can reach out to the inspector who did the inspection and ask questions. Well, you know, in looking at this inspections, you know, I wanna make sure that I am understanding this as part of my responsibility. If I'm going to ask for something to be repaired, replace, credit, or a price reduction. So can you elaborate a little bit more on what this paragraph emphasizes, right? Number 3, buyers should discuss with their agent the consequences of removing a contingency attempt negotiations and cancellations. Well, remember, folks, you know, if you represent the buyer, it is crystal clear in your position that you know, you're guiding and advising your client in the importance and understanding once a buyer releases that as a condition that it's exposing their deposit. And if you need the time necessary to release that, then you need to be on making those calls with the listing agent, asking for an extension of time, which is the ETA form, the extension of time to release that as a condition. Because what if it's a 10-day, the inspection company cancels, they fail to show up? I mean, there's so many things that can, you know, jeopardize your position. You want to be on the forefront of this and ask for an extension. Don't wait till the last minute and ask for an extension. You know, you want to be proactive, and obviously communication is crucial and very important. Because if I have great dialogue with the listing agent, then it's going to be an easier conversation for me to ask for an extension to release a contingency. And the listing agent may ask you, well, what's the reason you want an extension? Well, this is the reason. You know, unfortunately, we had a cancellation last minute. He or she got sick, and you know, they canceled on us, and now we're scrambling to find another inspection to be conducted. We need that extra time because the original time, unfortunately, is not going to work. That's where you need to be very diligent in your approach. Okay, so don't wait till the final day of contingency period to conduct investigations or request the repairs. Yeah, Because remember, the seller does not have to grant an extension to release that, the 17-day, and that's it. The listing agent can say, I'm giving you to the 17-day, either remove it or we cancel. And they may not budge, and there's nothing that I can do or the buyer can do if they're not cooperating with you. Okay, so make sure you're diligent and you're being proactive, and don't wait till the last minute. 5 days prior, a week prior, if you know something is not going to work or cancel, or you got to push it, you better pick up the phone and start making those calls. Additional resources, obviously the quick guide, Q&A, request of repairs using the RR and the RRRR form. How a seller may cancel a purchase agreement, Q&A questions, and then legal tools from the negotiations after inspection, which was done back in 2019. Okay. Any questions?
Not for me.
All right. No one else?